Hello, guys. I am here at Dr. Casebeer's request to kind of walk you through special education policies and procedures. And so this is the scavenger hunt that you have is going to walk you through the same information. This is off the Mississippi Department of Education website. This is their policies and procedures manual. It was originally developed in 2009, and it's been updated in 2013. So Dr. Casebeer will talk to you about how you make sure that you're in the right one and that you're getting the most up-to-date information. So just a little bit of background about how Mississippi policies and procedures work. In Mississippi, the connection between the three-tier model, the RTI model, and special education works this way. That for a child to be referred for special education services, they have to have first gone through the three-tier model, the RTI model, unless there are certain conditions met. So, for instance, if a child has what the district considers to be an obvious disability. So, in other words, if we've got a child who has been homeschooled, the parents bring him into the school, he's 13, he's nonverbal, he's in a wheelchair, then it's pretty obvious that this child is going to need special education services. They still have to go and fill out what's called a teacher narrative, which is a referral form. So the teacher still has to give information about the child and the child's needs so that we can do what's called a child find. And the child find, I'm sorry, I do that every time, a child study. The child study is where the MEET team sits down and they look at every piece of data that we have on that child, everything that's ever been written down about that child by anybody, and then they decide whether a child needs to be referred. So other than that, all children that are coming into the process we're going to talk about today already went through RTI. Other exceptions, if the parent requests that the child be tested, then we immediately go into this process. Also, if the child was declared eligible in another school district, even out of state, then we go ahead and start with this process. Typically, what they're going to do is they're going to be doing the RTI simultaneously with the comprehensive assessment if the child is bypassing RTI. So we go ahead and do RTI while we're doing the comprehensive assessment. So that's a little bit of background. Where the regs start is they start by talking about parental consent. Like all legal documents, it's wordy, it's complex, it's a pain in the neck. You just simply have got to read it and read for the questions that you're being asked. So, for instance, on this first question, Dr. Casebeer is asking you if a public agency is seeking parental consent for evaluation, what does that mean? And then she has very specific things that she's talking about. So there is a section that says parental consent. Parental consent in Mississippi is different for initial evaluation than it is for eligibility, and it's different for it's also different for reevaluation. And in each of these cases, what makes it different is how it affects how it is affected by, maybe is a better way of putting it, how it is affected by the opportunity for due process. So you got to go back to what you remember about due process that you've had in other classes. The idea, can the parents contest what the district wants? Can the district contest what the parents want? So on some of these areas of consent, there can be no due process. On other areas of the consent, there can be. Now, I'm not going to give you the answer. You've got to look for it. But what you're looking for is due process allowable in each of these areas of parental consent? So let's talk broadly about parental consent. It is informed consent. So what that means is that the parents not only have to say yes or no, I agree to this, but they have to understand what they're agreeing to. And so you are required to explain to them what it is you want, what the timeline is on whatever it is you want, and what kinds of procedures will be involved, and what they're actually consenting to. So if we're talking about consent for initial evaluation, you have to say you are consenting to the following assessments being done on your child. You have to list them. You have to say, we're going to give this child an IQ test called the WISC. And then you have to tell them what the WISC is. You say to them, we're going to give them an achievement test that is called the Woodcock-Johnson Psychoeducational Battery. And then you have to tell them what that test is like. You have to tell them things like how long the test will take, who's going to give them the test, where it'll be given. All of those things the parent needs to know. If they just say, yes, I'll let my child be tested, and you haven't explained any of that, then down the road they can say, this is not what I agreed to, because they didn't know what they were agreeing to. So informed consent means that you have to make sure that they have all those things done. So with the different types of consent, when we're talking about for evaluation, what we're saying is, do they consent for their child to be tested for eligibility for special education? So that's the first type of consent we have to have. The consent has to be in writing. The other question you want to know is, will this consent be, will we allow this to be open to due process? The second thing you need to know about each of these areas of consent is whether or not when they give this consent, it can be taken back. So in other words, if we say we're consenting to our child being tested, and then you start testing them and I say, you know something, I don't want this to happen anymore. Am I allowed to do that? If on consent for services, I say, yes, I consent to my child having services, can I take that back later? So that's the other thing you want to be looking for in here is which of these things can be retracted at any point. The second type of consent, the first one is for initial evaluation. The second type of consent is for services. So in this case, what you're saying to the parent is, we have declared this child eligible. So do you want your child to receive services? Now, the deal with consenting to services is that what they're consenting to is not just that my child is going to receive special ed services, but I'm consenting to the specific services being offered on the IEP. So consent for services is tied to the IEP. So what we're consenting to is that I'm going to allow my child to receive these specific services with these specific accommodations in this particular setting over this time period. And so, again, if the parent does not come to the IEP meeting, then can they give informed consent? And the answer is only if you go over the IEP with them and say, now this is what we're offering. Is this what you are consenting to? When we talk about due process, it's not just due process of whether the district can disagree with the parent or the parent can disagree with the district, but it has to do with, if the parent says no, can the district do it anyway? So on consent for evaluation, if the parent says no, can the district go ahead and assess that child anyway? Same thing with initial services. If the parent says, no, I do not want services, is there any way the district can override that? That's the question that you're going to be looking for when you look at the regs. Can the district say, parent said no, but we're going to give them services anyway? That's the question you're trying to answer. Then the third thing has to do with reevaluation. Now, consent for reevaluation. You need to know, if the parent says, no, you cannot reevaluate my child, then what does that mean about the child's services? Because it says we have to reevaluate or at least review records every 3 years. If the parent says, no, you can't do that, then does the child lose services? I'm not going to tell you. You've got to look in the regs and see if you can find that. Okay? So that's what we're looking for when we're looking at consent. So the next thing it talks about is evaluation. What actually happens in the evaluation procedures. Now, in Mississippi, the way evaluation works is that we have a system that is called comprehensive evaluation. In fact, most states call it comprehensive evaluation. In Mississippi, it begins with what we call child study. I already mentioned this to you. What happens in child study is there's a committee that is called the MEET team, MEET. And the MEET team gathers all the information that's already available on the child. So this is going to include the teacher support team's data that they did during RTI. It's going to include any teacher records that the teacher has. The teacher has to fill out a referral form that in Mississippi we call a teacher narrative. It's like a 7-page document, and it includes information about all the different academic areas and social behavioral areas. Absolutely essential that when the teacher fills that out, that they're thorough about it, because the assessment team is going to use that to decide what they're going to assess. What the MEET team during child study is looking for is they're wanting to answer this question: is there a school performance problem? And so they're going to gather the information from RTI, from the teacher support team, the teacher narrative, but they're also going to look at the child's permanent records. So they're going to look at discipline referrals, they're going to look at attendance patterns, they're going to look at information from other schools. Has the child been assessed before? Have they gone through this process before but then not declared eligible, or did the parent decide not to receive services? They're going to be looking at, has this child been getting remedial reading services? Just everything that's in that. Are there doctor reports in there? Are there reports from social workers? Just anything that's in that record that looks at the areas of language, physical, emotional, social, behavioral, and academics. And so that's what we're looking at. And so then what the MEET team is going to say is they're going to say, wow, we see a school performance problem in the following areas. And they're going to list of those 5 areas which one of those they see problems in. The comprehensive assessment will only look at the areas that the MEET team indicates. So if the MEET team says what we see a school performance problem in is physical and social, behavioral, and academics, then that's all they're going to test. So it's really important that the MEET team gets enough information to do what it is that they want to do. So the assessment team is appointed once the MEET team says, yes, there's a school performance problem. By the way, they can say no. They can say there's not a school performance problem, and it ends there. They say, we don't see one. Or they can say, we think we kind of sort of might see that, but we don't have enough information. They can send it back to the teacher support team to have them gather more information. Most of the time, if it gets to this point, they're going to give the thumbs up and they're going to move on, because the teacher support team should have done their job, which means the teacher support team's got to be doing their job, which is a whole other issue for another day that I'm sure Dr. Casebeer would just love for me to spend another half hour on. So moving on. So the MEET team says, yes, we see a school performance problem. An assessment team is gathered. Now, what should be and what truly is one of the big questions we have in special education. What the state regs say is that you cannot be assessed by one person. So it's supposed to be a team of people. Reality is there's a school psychologist who's going to do almost all the testing. Typically, you're going to, if speech and language is a problem, then a speech and language specialist will do the speech and language part. If there's social behavioral problems, typically the teachers are going to be interviewed for that, and also possibly the parents may be interviewed for that. But most of the time, the school psychologist is going to do almost all the testing, even though we talk about an assessment team. So just want you to know that. So then they're going to gather information. They have to gather norm reference data. And you remember from class, norm reference data is data that compares the child's performance to the children that were in the norm group for the test. So children of the same age, the typical child of that same age. And so with what we're looking at with norm reference data is how far the kid is from, quote, typical. And so what we're looking for is whether there's a disability, because disability is going to be defined by how far you are from the norm, the middle. Okay? And then we have to also do criterion-based testing. And so what that's looking at is comparing the child to the standard. And so what we're looking at there is, for instance, here are the set of skills that somebody should know in 5th grade. And which of these skills does the child know and which one does he not know? Which is he mastered, which is he not mastered? Which does he do and which does he not do? Notice I'm not saying can do, because you can't measure what somebody can do. You only measure what they do. All right. So we're going to do norm reference and criterion reference testing. Both of that is part of the comprehensive assessment. After the comprehensive assessment is done, then they write an assessment team report. And with that assessment team report, what they're going to do is they're going to go to the very end of this document, the very end of the policies document. It has a list of disability categories. And so if what this pattern in this assessment seems to show is that this child has a learning disability, then they're going to look at the learning disability criteria, and they're going to go down the list of learning disability criteria, and they're going to check them off. Yes, the child has average IQ. Yes, there is a discrepancy between ability and achievement. No, he did not respond to intervention. And they're going to go down that list, and then they're going to say, yes, he meets the eligibility criteria in the state of Mississippi for a specific learning disability in reading comprehension. And then they will say, this is what he's eligible for. Once he's declared eligible on the assessment team report, that doesn't make him eligible for anything. That just says, the assessment team just says, this is what we see. The eligibility team, the MEET team, meets again, and they look at the assessment team data, and they say, oh, yeah, definitely he meets the eligibility. Or they say, there's some contradictions there in what this assessment report says, that yes, on this test it says this, but on this test it says that. In that case, they send it back to the assessment team, and they say, assessment team, you have contradictory data. You have got to either do some additional testing so that you can fill in the contradictions, or you need to write us a justification as to why these are not contradictions. We cannot have contradictions on an assessment report without them being explained. But the assessment team is the one that has to do that. The MEET team says, yeah, okay, you've cleared that up for us. Thank you. He is eligible. So the MEET team either says he's eligible, and then we call an IEP meeting, or they say he's not eligible, and they say thank you very much, and they send the assessment team into his report into his file, which the general ed teacher can look at to find strengths and weaknesses to continue their teaching. Or they can say contradictory, not enough information, and send it back to the assessment team. Okay. Okay. In part of what has to happen is that the assessments have to be free from bias, and they have to be technically sound. And by technically sound, we mean they have to have reliability and validity. Your book does a good job of talking about reliability and validity, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. The State Department has approved a set of assessments that the examiners are allowed to use. And so the State Department supposedly has made sure that all of the instruments that they have approved are technically valid, that they are reliable, that they are valid, and that they do not have cultural bias. But the examiner is supposed to use their good judgment as to what is the best assessment for this particular child in this particular school. An example of this would be, for instance, if you've got doing an IQ test. Well, typically in Mississippi, they're going to use either the WISC, or they're going to use the Stanford-Binet, or they're going to use the Kaufman. 3 very different tests. Some of the decision on that is going to be based on just examiner preference, that some of the examiners prefer one over the other. But some of it is based on what we're testing for. So if you've got a young child and you're thinking what we're looking at according to what we saw in RTI is a learning disability, then you're typically going to use the Kaufman, because the Kaufman is more geared toward finding those distinctions that we're looking for a learning disability. On the other hand, if you're looking at a kid with RTI, what we found was he was just low functioning in everything, everything he did was just way, way below everybody else, then you're typically not going to do the Kaufman, because the Kaufman is not as good a test for kids with intellectual disabilities. But as a teacher, you have no say-so in that the assessment team is going to make those decisions. Now, the MEET team can come back and say, why did you use that assessment? We're not sure that tapped into what we're looking for, and that's where your contradictions came from. But the school psychologist is the arbiter of that. They are the ones that have to decide what it is they're going to use. If you have questions like that, Dr. Casebeer is much stronger in assessment than I am. She can tell you all about that kind of stuff. Okay, now, one of the things in the procedures you got to look at very carefully is there's a whole set of special procedures for learning disabilities. There are special tests that must be done. There are special observations that must be done. There are special questions that have to be asked. So be sure you look carefully at the section on learning disabilities, because there's a whole set of questions that you have to answer on that one. So be sure you check those out. All righty. So then when we start looking at eligibility, what we have to look at is, what are the tests that have to be done in preschool? Early intervention, birth through 3, there's a whole set of assessments that are different from everywhere else. Also in birth through 3, we've got a category of kids at risk that is not allowed to be used in any other age range. So you need to know about that. When we get into 3 to 5, actually 3 to 9, we have a category that's called developmental delays. That's a whole nother set of information that you have to have. So there are special assessments for early intervention. There are special assessments for ages 3 to 5, but there are also special procedures. Obviously, birth to 3, they're not in school. So that leads to a set of procedures that are going to be different. 3 to 5, they typically are not in school, or they may be in Head Start. So that's another whole set of procedures. There's a set of procedures for kids that are not in school because they're being homeschooled or because their parents just didn't bring them to school. So the set of procedures we have to do when they're in school is going to be completely different if they're out of school. So be sure that you check all of those procedures. Now, when you get to the end, there are disability categories. The Mississippi list of disability categories is the same as the federal. There are places where we may call it something slightly different than the federal language, but it is the federal list. But what's most important is when you're looking at the disability categories, it is essential that you look at how they define the disability. But then once we get past the definition, then we look at what the eligibility category criteria is for that. So, for instance, if we're looking at, I'm going to use one that you probably won't encounter much, but if we're looking, for instance, at visual impairment, the definition of visual impairment is one thing. How we gather assessment data that meets that criteria is a completely different thing. So that section at the end, that's what it tells you. It tells you this is the definition, and then it says, as a MEET team, here are the things you're looking for to say, yes, this child meets the criteria for this particular disability. So that's what you're looking at. Okay, I hope this kind of, just got you oriented to what you're doing. What Dr. Casebeer wants you to do, and when I taught this class, what I wanted you to do is to get used to reading state and federal regs. Here's why it's important for you to do that. It is important for you to do that because as a teacher, there will be times that your principal will be telling you one thing, and your special ed director is going to be telling you something else. And then you'll have a parent advocate who's going to be coming in saying a whole other thing. So you need to be comfortable with going to the State Department of Education website and finding something on there in this set of policy procedures where you can bring it to your whoever's on top of you, the principal or the special ed director, and say, I know this is what you're saying, but this is what the regs say. So don't we need to look at this? This is the best way. The best way for you to advocate for yourself is to be able to find it in the regs. Now, there are always people. You can call the State Department. There are people there that will help you. You can call us, and we'll dig and help you find it. So you're not ever going to be by yourself on it. But there's a real confidence to be able to say to your special ed director, well, in the policy and procedures manual on page 300, on section 300.301, it says, and that gives you a little bit of strength and confidence to be able to do that. I hope this helped you. Good luck. Go forth and prosper.